welcome you to this research colloquium. And the people speaking need no introduction because their reputations precede them. These two faculty members, these two scientists, Dr. Cepeda, Alice Cepeda, and Dr. Lala Valdez will have this hour with us. You will have some opportunity to ask some questions. This is going to be extremely instructive, given that their work is so impactful. So I thank you very much for your willingness to present to us today.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to introduce the project. And then
dating phone for me.
All right. Sorry.
And then Alice will continue it, and then we'll jump in back and forth, doing it what we describe as tag team presentation. All right. So this is the title of our talk, obviously focusing on deported Americans, and we use that term very consciously, and we can get into a discussion about what I mean by that. This is a research project that's sponsored by the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Minority Disparities, and the project focuses on what we call floating immigrant populations. That is populations population of Mexicans that come into the United States and then return. And in the United States, we've been having this pattern of immigration from that country for the last 100 years, right, going back to the turn of the century. The premise of the study is looking at the vulnerability to health risks and stresses arising from this whole process, and things like poverty, discrimination, cultural differences that happen, and the objective is to study or to understand what we call the mechanisms by which this immigration process occurs in more detail, and how that process makes them very susceptible to risk behaviors and contributes to mental and physical health disparities, as well as some other kinds of health issues, infectious diseases, alcohol and drug dependency, and other kinds of health issues that this population experiences in this process. The target population, as I said before, is floating populations, and
we have the migration.
Sorry. So the migration framework. This is a framework that's actually developed by other researchers, and we adapted it. And when as you can see by the slide, when we talk about floating populations, it's populations who are recent immigrants to the United States. In our study, we focused on immigrants in Los Angeles metropolitan area. And we did that very consciously because, contrary to kind of a general thinking about immigrants, in the last 15, 20 years, most immigrants coming into the United States are coming from large urban areas, which is very distinct from 20 or 30 years ago, when immigration from Mexico was primarily from agricultural areas. Also, those immigrants now that are coming to the United States are moving into cities, or are from large cities themselves, right? And are moving into the, of course, cities like Los Angeles, like Chicago, like the traditional receiving communities, but also in other parts of the United States. And I'm always amazed when I look at the data about Mexican immigrants in the US. And just an example, the other day I heard that in Nashville, 32% of students in the public school systems are of Mexican descent. So you can see the widespread of immigration to the US in the last 20 years. And of course, we know that there's huge populations in the Atlanta metropolitan area, Mexican immigrants in North and South Carolina, up in Massachusetts, Southern Florida, and so forth. And then we're also looking at those that have returned to Mexico. Now, most of these have been through deportation. So what happens to this population when they return? So what's happening, however, is a kind of a floating process, right? People going back and forth, back and forth. So that's And what this migration phase framework allows us to kind of follow this on these various steps that they go through, including the whole deportation process itself, the legal deportation process that happens. So, like I said, this is a floating population. We're interested in the health outcomes as are indicated up on this slide. And we've used a mixed method of design. We have a survey that we've conducted. We're conducting in Mexico City, and the survey that we're doing here in LA. I failed to mention that what we're looking at return migrants, those are immigrants that are returning to Mexico City. And again, the reason for that, I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, the reason for that is because we're finding that most Mexicans are now coming from urban areas, and that there's the way that we discovered this is looking at remittances. When you look at remittances, the largest amount of remittances to the United States into the United States are from the metropolitan Mexico City area. So this is kind of a different kind of a twist. So we did surveys in both those cities, LA and Mexico City, and we're also doing ethno interviews, which we'll share with some of those interviews with you later in the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Cepeda.
Thank you. So given we wanted to give you kind of an update, and I think we can talk. If we had all day, right? We could talk about the methodology of doing this kind of work, and kind of the challenges that I think all our colleagues that are virtual and those of you in the room here as well, is that the challenges and the burdens that happened these last couple of years with implementing research studies, given the challenges with COVID. And for us in particular, as you can see in LA, we're currently at 213 surveys. And in Mexico City, we've pretty much wrapped up our survey phase with 307 interviews, and we're still doing some ethnographic interviews that myself, Lalo, and some of our team does. I want to emphasize that this is a street-based outreach approach, which is the kind of work that we do to identify these hard to reach, hidden populations. So we've been doing, putting on our tennis shoes and going out, knocking on doors and really finding people on the streets of Mexico City and in LA. And for some historical perspective, this study got funded right when Trump became president. And so we were dealing initially too with kind of the challenges of immigration policy enforcement, where a lot of, especially here in LA, a lot of the sample was very hesitant to, even consider participating, much less, the COVID burden, right? Everybody locked up. So we can talk about this kind of challenge for days.
No, and not to mention human subjects issues.
Yeah. Suzanne knows, right? Like we were dealing with human, with the IRB here saying, you guys have to let us back out in the field. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but this is the perfect time to also study the effects that COVID was having on this very, very marginalized population. So yeah, that's where we stand with our data collection. We wanted to give everybody a little bit of context in regards to where we are at in terms of how did we get here to these deportations very specifically, and how it's impacting this population. We're not going to speak too much about the LA sample. We want to focus more on our Mexico City sample. But as you can see here, there's and we could probably go back even further, but these are just some highlights. Like in '96, the U.S. Illegal Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act basically expanded the list of what is identified as deplorable crimes. that include misdemeanors like fraud, ID fraud, which we know a lot of immigrants, engage in, drug, tax evasion. And it was also the year that re-entry into the country, unauthorized re-entry, was classified as a felony. If you were caught at re-entry in the country back in '96, you were automatically given a 2-year prison sentence and potentially a 10-year prison sentence if you had a prior conviction. In '96 as well, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, judges basically lost all discretionary power to cancel deportations. And if we think about what Trump did as well in terms of nominating a lot of kind of conservative judges, that had an impact, obviously. We also saw for the first time these mass hearings and removal without due process or any kind of judicial review. 2003, ICE gets created, Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and it expanded into the interior of the US. So no longer was Border Patrol and immigration enforcement just focused on border areas along the US-Mexico or Canada border, but you actually saw ICE operating all across the country in the interior of the US. And a lot of that was associated too with the assistance of county police and city law enforcement, where unauthorized immigrants were basically turned over to ICE. To immigration.
Yeah, and there was a lot of new technology that also appeared during that period that was actually developed in the Middle East with the wars in the Middle East, with all kinds of X-ray and technology that was able to detect people out in rural areas. And so you have this whole area of the borders now just covered with dollars that rolled over from the Middle East. Right, that technology now is being implemented all across the United States.
And databases, the creation of these large mass databases with people's identification that now is being shared across the country with law enforcement. And then in the mid-2000s, also the criminal alien program, which was basically the ability to deport immigrants incarcerated for prior convictions, including legal permanent residents or people who actually had completed their sentences. So that occurred.
And I think that just for sake of discussion here, I know is that we also have during these U.S. immigration policies that you're seeing, parallel to that was all kinds of new policies regarding crime. So and especially with the war on drugs. So you have the war on crime, the war on drugs, and you have these immigration policies all created this kind of legal apparatus in which immigrants were caught up in, as well as a lot of other people. But it all augmented even the immigration laws with the new laws that were enacted during this period as well, going back a few years earlier. But
yeah, and it basically, like for instance, recently. There was a statistic that said immigration offenses are actually the most common federal crime now, surpassing drug crimes. And the fact that all of this has created also, it's resulted in an increase in voluntary departures. So when individuals are apprehended by ICE, they are told if you don't sign a voluntary departure, you could be imprisoned for up to 10 or more years. So a lot of the data that I will show you is this is actually happening, where young men and women are saying, all right, well, I'll just sign my voluntary departure and go back to Mexico and not have to serve 10 years incarcerated here in the States. And some of the photographs we have here on this presentation are actually from our team. So this young man he got caught in Charlotte. He still had his plane ticket, straight to Mexico City. So as Lala was saying, right, we have this deportation carceral system, which has basically criminalized, militarized, and removed large numbers of young men and women. This is just a video that I took because we knew that there was planes coming into the Mexico City airport on a daily basis, full of deportees. And you can see on this video, they line them up, they carry their belongings in those orange bags, they give them a little sandwich. Many of these men are actually catching flights to the interior, to other parts of Mexico, not Mexico City. So they basically load them onto buses and they give them a ticket and they say, what part of Mexico do you want to go to? They drive them to the bus stations in Mexico City and then they catch buses to their respective hometowns. I did myself and a field worker, another field staff went out there on a number of occasions and there were just like, you know, flights coming in, 2 or 3 flights a day of these deportees. And a footnote, I wanted to see what flights, you know, they were coming, and these were actually chartered flights. And I looked up the company, and it's a company based out of Miami, ran by some Cuban American who owns this charter company, who has this contract with the feds to deport, you know, this population.
Yeah, we won't mention what the connections were to get that contract.
Yeah. So, you know, right now that we have this, you know, challenge of this massive amount of data that we're collecting, but you can see here just our deportee sample. These are young men and women who are being deported to Mexico City, relatively young age, primarily men. We do have a smaller proportion of women, and you know, I could speak about that in a Q&A. Relatively equal in terms of marital status, many of them single, but we have an equal representation of married or separated, divorced. The one time migrated to the US, over 60%, and these are primarily the men that we'll be sharing some clips about. And look at the number in terms of children left behind. Over 45% of them have left children behind. And then you could see a little distribution in terms of mental health and their experiences upon arriving in the US.
Yeah, can I say one thing about these individuals is that they are not the dreamers. So we have to distinguish this from the dreamers. Everybody talks about the dreamers, but people that there are a lot of people that don't fall under the dreamer category. You know, most of a lot of these men, you know, had already a misdemeanor or a couple of misdemeanors. And so this is a different population. This is a much larger population than the dreamers. Dreamers only covered a small proportion. And these are the people that are being deported.
But we can say, and right now we have a challenge of disaggregating, because while the majority of the sample are these deportees who left as children, we were very conscious of the fact that we also had people that were deported, but their history of immigration was as adults, and they lived in the States for a handful of years, got apprehended by ICE and got returned, right? So we're still disaggregating some of that data, but you can see here in terms just of basic quantitative data in regards to mental health, depression, PTSD, and psychological distress. And this is the challenge of, like, you know, we see high rates of PTSD, and we're looking at it across kind of the distinct immigration processy experiences. So the history of immigration in transit, you know, their history in the destination. But one thing that we can say, and we'll depict it in these qualitative clips, is the fact that this is a population that is dealing with very high, severe mental health issues and anxiety, distress, psychological distress. And so one of the challenges for us and how we want to contribute to the existing literature is really looking at how these distinct immigration experiences contribute to these outcomes, right? And this is why we have these migration phases framework, because it's not just the immigration itself, right? The transit, it's the transit to the destination, the interception, being intercepted, and then now coming back. And so we have some of those, we'll have some of those phases represented in our population. So, you know, because I know we want to have some time to discuss, we wanted to give you some themes that are emerging from our ethnographic and qualitative data. And one of these is to give you a sense, a little bit of the deportation experience. So Lalo, I know you interviewed this young man. I don't know if you want to say anything before I play it.
This is Smokey, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Smokey was obviously 31 years old. He grew up, left when he was obviously left Mexico when he was very young. Grew up in Chicago, outside of Chicago, in I think some suburb. And it's really interesting that what we're finding that a lot of the immigrants now, again, something different that we know about immigrants. Many of them are living in what I call now urban suburban slums on the outskirts of cities like Chicago or Minnesota or Detroit. These apartment buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s that have really deteriorated, and they've really become what I call suburban slums now. This kind of new face of poverty. And so this guy was from a small, I can't think of not Bloomingdale. I was not Evansville. I forgot exactly. He was outside of Chicago and grew up in that environment. A lot of in that community is a lot of Mexican immigrants and also a lot of African Americans living out in these areas. So this was his background. He's very talkative, very articulate. You're going to hear him speak about his experience.
You were in state prison though. This was happening in state prison?
In immigration.
Immigration, but tell me what happened when you were in state prison and they came up to you and told you were going to be deported. How was that? How did that come down?
I couldn't believe it. Like, why? They're like, you're free from us now. I got 72 hours to come pick you up. So I couldn't believe it. Like, why would they pick me up? Like, I thought
you thought you were a U.S. citizen?
Yeah, my mentality, I was a USA citizen, you know? I'm like, why they don't come for me? Nah, they ain't coming for me. So it was 24 hours,
you
48.
Were in prison.
Yeah.
You were, what prison were you in Chicago, in Illinois?
Stateville.
Stateville.
Yeah. So I was like, man, I can't believe it. Man. They ain't gonna come for me. So I couldn't. I didn't took like seriously. I didn't take it seriously. Like, nah, they ain't gonna come for me. So it was 24 hours and they didn't come for me. 48 hours, they didn't come for me. So I was like counting the time. It was like 3 in the morning. I was like, yeah, they don't come by 7. I'm good. They gotta let me out. They can't keep me here more than 72 hours.
But what do you mean? Where were you? You were
in prison. Yeah.
What do you mean 72 hours?
Because I got out for my crime.
You got out for your crime.
Yeah, but they won't let you out. They'll have you. They'll scan you if you have any orders of detaining any other corporation. So my name popped out with ICE.
Oh, I see. So you served your time for the crime.
Yeah.
And you're ready to get out, but then your list came up as a possible deportee by ICE.
Exactly.
So now you're waiting in jail to see what happens.
Because I'm waiting, because they gotta let me out in 72 hours. They can't detain me no more, because that's kidnapping now. So it was. I'm telling you, I was counting the hours too, you know. So it was like a couple hours before 7 in the morning when they're like 201, 204. Like, yeah. Pack your shit, because you're going back to Mexico. They just came for you. I'm like, man. And everybody looked at me like, oh. I'm like, no mames, kind of like, fine, I ain't going, dog. They're like, man. They're like, come on, pack your shit, I don't got your time. Man, I ain't going. I told that nigga, I ain't going. Tell that nigga I don't want to go. I want to stay here. He's like, man, come on. I'm like, man, I ain't going, man. So then he's like, all right, hold on. Ooh, we have a table. Next thing you see a fucking group of like 6 motherfuckers with helmets and just everything, bro. Like they were gonna go to war. They're like, 201, 204, you got 3 seconds to come down here, we gonna come for you. Man, as soon as I saw them niggas, I was like, yo, let's go. I don't want to deal with y'all, man, because they won't play. Those fools don't play. That's what they're there for, to hit motherfuckers.
So that kind of gives you, and he goes on to describe, right, like, you know, just the whole process of him being taken from that jail, you know, back and sent back on a flight back to Mexico.
But you can see like just
You were in state prison though.
how Americanized he is, right? I mean, there's not this, he just grew up in the inner city and took on all the characteristics of the inner city, and all of a sudden he finds himself back in Mexico City with no family, no connections, nothing, right? And that was kind of a, you know, one of the examples of kind of a typical that we found.
Very typical. And this is a second interview we did with a young man who got deported from Indianapolis. He had been living in the States for 18 years. He arrived in Indianapolis at the age of 3. We transcribed this because it's really hard to hear him. When I was doing the interview, I was having a hard time. It's just his dialect, his accent, but you know, just so that you could hear again.
Alice,
Some people, it's like war. You know, it's like when they send you to war. Some people are not adequate for war. You know, some people come back messed up from the head. Why? Because everything is here, and they wasn't made for it. You know, the same thing here. Just like they deport us, just like they're deporting us to a war. Yeah. War we don't know nothing of. You know, it's like some like me, who grew up in the States all my life. To deport me when I'm an adult, somewhere I had no idea of, you know? Mm-hmm. Somewhere I don't even know how to file my taxes here, how to make a job, how to file for employment, how to get my ID here, nothing, you know? Because everything they taught me was in the States, in the school system, you know? How to get your ID there, how do you do it there, you know? So you're sending me out to a jungle where I know nothing of. Mm-hmm. What do you want me to do? The only option you're giving some of us is to commit more crimes because we don't know what to do, you know?
So, I mean, he equates as like, he talked the whole interview just trying to adapt to this new context, right? Given the fact that all he knew was Indiana, right? And I thought it was really interesting about how he's conceptualizing this, you know, as being similar to what he had heard in the past about going to a war, into a country that, you know, didn't know anything about why they were there. The other theme that is emerging is the impact that these deportations is having on family that is left behind. This young man, we were actually doing an interview. A lot of these men are now ending up working in barbershops. So, you know, you see barbershops popping up in Mexico City. You know, you would think you're in East LA or, you know, in Highland Park. So a lot of these young men are working there. And so we were doing an interview of another young man, and I saw this young guy sitting in the bathroom. He was kind of squatting down and he was washing dishes. He had just been deported. He had just gotten into the city, and he knew this young man that owned the barbershop because they went to high school together. And so he was staying at the barber shop. He was living there for you know, because he had nowhere to go. And so he talks a little bit about the impact on his family. Let's see if I can play this.
That's it. And well, my mom's still sick. She's actually, like right now, she's really sick, like every other weekend. She has to go to the hospital She's at that point. I recently had another son. My daughters, literally, I no bullshit. I tell my wife to do it, but she don't do it. My daughters, they cry for me. Daddy, I miss you. All of a sudden, they're sad. They cry for me. I miss you because my wife, she actually, the times that I've been here, like these 5 years, she's been here sometimes.
She comes.
Yeah, she comes. The first time she was here for 1 year and 8 months. I even had my daughter going to school, but it was an awful experience for her because the kids bullied her.
Yeah.
No Spanish.
Can you imagine?
No.
It's come full circle, right?
Exactly.
It's like,
So what I went through, my kids are going through over here. You know, and having to go on the transportation, everything, walking, el tianguis, no tenemos carro, like. Just bad. It's just so bad that they don't want to come over here anymore. They don't want to come. They love me. They want to see me. My
They want you over there.
They want me over there. They don't want to be here no more. They don't want to struggle. So basically, I'm putting them through that.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not fair
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
For them as American family, for them to go, but they don't want to leave me. So what can we do? My wife keeps coming back. I keep having kids, and it's not gonna stop because that was my goal. Have 7 kids, have a house, company, family, everybody. I'm the provider. Come, you know. Because whenever we pulled up to the States, they treated us so bad that I want to be different.
Yeah. So again, just for context, this guy was leaving work. He had 6 or 7 guys working for him. He put tile in bathrooms, and he missed a stop sign, made a turn, and the cop stopped him, and it just went downhill from there.
And he tried to get his family to come back. You know, if you've noticed that he brought his family, most of these, well, about half had wives or husbands
And children were
children.
American.
And this guy tried to bring his children back to Mexico with him, but you can see the children they have a really weird status, and they don't get into the school systems, and there's all kinds of legal morass they have to go through to get their kids.
And many don't speak Spanish or barely can speak Spanish. So you add another layer.
That's it.
And then the last clip is this issue of adaptation that we were talking, I think, informally. For those of you online, we're talking informally about this with people here, is this whole issue of adaptation. So it's almost kind of like, you know, a life of adapting to new contexts for many of these young men and women. This young guy, I've been interviewing him now for the last couple of years. Every time I go down there, I catch up with him. He was just shy of turning 18, and he got arrested and he got deported. And so he's really had a really hard time adapting. And so this was the last interview I did with him, and you could hear what he says about this process.
Well, I was scared at first because you know, somebody from the States and here in Mexico, they look like you got money.
Yeah.
You come from the States.
Yeah.
And well, back then people used to look at me and judge me, like as I said, you know, they're like, oh, you speak English, or they would look at me different. But once I got incarcerated, I started speaking a lot more Spanish than I did English. I was like, I'm keeping it low key.
Yeah.
That I don't let my English out that much. But then at the end, right before we knew that we were gonna get out, I was like, all right, I speak English, man. Like, I'm from the States. I do this, I do that, and like that full experience that I had from in there changed. That it didn't matter now that if I was from the States or not. Like now I walk the streets and people look at me and they think I'm just another normal Mexican because I just speak a lot more Spanish now than I did then than before. and the thing is now I got their lingo. You know, they talk a lot. They have an accent, the way they talk. So I started talking like that. So now the people that they're like, yeah, he's just another Mexican. He probably learned English in school here or something like that. And I feel a little more integrated when I go around about the streets. Because I can talk to people, I can ask questions, I can be like, hola, ¿cómo estás? Oye, es que estoy buscando esto. O ¿cómo le hago para llegar a este autobús? Oh, me dicen, no, you gotta go here, do this, do that. And I don't give that same vibe that I did. Like, if you look at me, I'm a mean mug you too. I was like, no, muchas gracias. I try to be the nicest person that I can. And it's crazy because like it's a lot more different. A lot of people treat you a little more differently from back when
you first got here. So this young man actually has been going through a process of he was using a lot of meth, and he caught up during the last couple of years, and he got incarcerated. So he did almost a year in a Mexican prison. And so those of you who don't know about Mexican prisons, we think prisons here are bad. It's really,
Times 10.
Yeah. So he talks a lot about that. And when I saw him the last time, he talked about trying to get off of meth. He's trying to take care of his health. So, but this has been a process, right? He got deported in 2015. So we were talking about, like, many of them are now trying to adapt to and trying to make a life there. We failed to mention that all of these, I would say 80% of the deportees who are working in the US, in Mexico, are working in call centers. This young kid worked for Best Buy. So there's all these American companies who have set up call centers in Mexico City. They know they have a captured labor force because they speak English, they have the technical skills, cheap labor, and you have T-Mobile, you have if you call
Amazon,
next time you call for any kind of help, just ask, well, where are you located? And I would assure you that 9 times out of 10, it'll be in Mexico and some Latin American country now.
Yeah, and I think one thing about all these is that most of them come to Mexico City with no family ties, hardly at all. They're just thrown into the city and then have to find a place to live, find jobs, and almost no support from the state. So it's just a real difficult adaptation. And being of Mexican descent in a country like Mexico, and really not being accepted there. And many of them talk about all the problems they have in the States as being a Mexican American. So it's like there's nowhere they don't really have found it's a different kind of dimension in Mexico City. But so we're gonna wrap just for some kind of discussion. We really see the deportation of these guys, really see them as being Americans, right? They are Americans in all sense of the word. They're socialized here at a very, very early age. They have the norms and rituals and ideologies of the US. They're functional Americans. Other countries like in Europe have found the ways to reintegrate them back. But we have not. We're deporting really, really functional Americans that seem American. So I think this is something that we really need to think of very, very carefully. And of course, the whole collateral consequences on families. We didn't talk a lot about the families they left behind. Remember, about 30 or 40% of them are married and have living with someone and have children. And so the burden on the families living in the United States with their husbands for the most part, and the separation that occurs in the children that are left behind. So it's a real serious consequence.
The challenges of adapting, right, and how this is contributing to these disparities across the board. I don't think I put the drug use in there, but we do have high rates of substance use, in particular meth. You know, I know Mathis now has become kind of this global kind of emerging new drug pattern. And for this population in particular, given the type of work they're doing, I mean, we're talking about 12-hour shifts sitting in front of a computer. And now since COVID, many of them are having to do it in their small little apartments. So math is something that we're keeping an eye on and trying to understand. So
Yeah, this goes into the whole issue of increasing drug use in Mexico, which we didn't see before. So we have a whole increase of drugs. You know, 20 years ago, you didn't see this. Now there's in large, especially in large cities, meth, crack, cocaine. So there's a whole increase, especially the communities in which these guys move into. You know, usually they're communities in which this is more prevalent. So
yeah, and we failed to mention that I mean, the recruitment approach of this has been also, it's not simple. I mean, they're not living, those of you who know Mexico City, they're not living in La Roma or Condesa, kind of the nice areas of Mexico City. They're living on the outskirts of the city in some of the most marginalized communities that, you know, Lalo and I have been working in for the past 10 years. And now we see this new influx of basically Americans moving into kind of these isolated neighborhoods.
and you know, I mean, what I believe, or we believe, that we're really creating a diaspora, right, of Mexicans being deported. And you know, this goes, and this is not something that just happened in these last few years. We saw this back in the 1930s, and we saw it even before that, the mass deportation of Mexicans, especially from here in Los Angeles. And you know, I think if we look at this in that kind of a framework, we can see the consequences of this in our society and where we're going. And we should learn from the lessons of what we've learned in the past about people being deported. And
so this is our team. I just want to shout out here in the room, we have Nefertari, who's our field person and our director of our research project here in LA. So Nef, I don't know if anybody can see you. And we've also integrated a new member to our team, Leticia, who is a first-year PhD student here. So Leticia is now incorporating herself into our team and has an interest in this population. So Leticia, welcome to the team. And you know, it's just, I think that if anybody can see that second picture, it's the American flag turned upside down next to the Mexican flag. And so we see a lot of these symbolisms as we are doing our work out in the field. And, you know, it's a contradiction because many, including the men that you heard from today, talk about like, you know, maybe I just have to stay here now. But there's this, they're torn by the fact that they've left family behind. And even though Alex, the last young man, talks about, you know, he's adapting, he still told me at the end, after the tape recorder was off, he says, I'm gonna go back, and I might actually go back sooner than later. So it's, you know, that's kind of the situation. Oh, this is just, we lost a very important member of our team in Mexico City. He was actually a gatekeeper, not in this project, on prior research projects that we had. You know, he was a victim of a violent crime, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Oscar, who we probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot of our work in Mexico City without his help.
yeah, so let's open it up for questions. I have about 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I saw two questions in the chat in reverse order. One was, what binational efforts are being taken at this point to try to address this issue of reintegration? That was one. And then the other, before I forget, is that how do some of the themes that you shared apply for young women specifically?
Well, let me address the first one. There are a group of us, not just here at USC, but other universities and other advocates are working on addressing policy issues, right? You know, we feel that there should be some kind of an amnesty given to these men and women who have been deported. These are, I mean, you think about the social capital that went into these men. I mean, if you think about education, I mean, what does it cost? Like $200,000 or $300,000 to go for someone to go to school from K to 12. I mean, just think of all the capital that's lost in all these events. So yes, we are trying to work on policies. We now have we have a meeting with the embassy in Mexico City to try to help us kind of advocate for this. So that's a real challenge of thinking of policy, changing policies for these, and also thinking of, from a social work perspective, how can we work with families that are left behind, right? And I think that that's kind of an area that we should be thinking about in terms of developing service specifically for these populations. So.
Yeah, that's a big factor, because everybody talks about the importance of, or they're talking about what they're going through, but we really don't understand what the families that are left behind are going through, and not just financially, but emotionally, especially families with really young children. So that's kind of an area that we're trying to kind of now explore. The women, so you saw that we do have a smaller percentage of women in the sample. We're trying to target that population, including here in LA, a little bit more. The women, for the most part, we do have women who are being deported, kind of the same trajectory that some of the young men that we just talked about or that we presented. However, we seem to be finding more women who have returned kind of pseudo voluntarily because of family obligations. So like somebody back in Mexico gets sick, they're 18, 19 years old, and the parents decide to go back and they take them with them. And so they're also, undocumented. And so the adaptation process is a little bit different. There seems to be kind of a little bit more family support for them. However, we are seeing among that sample or that population of young ladies is that they're now establishing partner relationships in Mexico and starting their own families. The issue of gender violence is also kind of, emerging in those, just being in violent relationships as they return. And this is just like one case, I think, Neff, one or two cases where we saw somebody actually fleeing a violent relationship in the States and going back to Mexico. So the women are definitely very distinct, and which is why we didn't want to incorporate them into this presentation, because I think they deserve kind of their own special attention. But we're very cognizant of that. Yeah.
I have an observation. So for 26 plus years, there's been a federal policy around immigration, really. I mean, I think about it sort of in the context of like, the deportation really is a issue around race, and I see it as a bad national policy. That's and what you've done in your study here is personalized it in a way that I think has the potential of maybe changing the narrative. And as you talk about sort of some binational sort of things, et cetera, but it's, I guess my judgment is you're still up against that thing. It's like, go back to where you came from. And then picking on a particular group that probably Americans say, well, these are the people that are, they're criminals, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's little to no support for these people, and yet at the same time they're human beings who lived long periods of time, grew up here, etc. And hearing you talk about them as Americans, again, I think changes the narrative in a really powerful way. So
that's a term that not just my term, other people have begun using that at immigrant advocates. So I want to emphasize, as American, these are Americans in all essential ways. They're American, except for their legal status, right? And so I think if we take that stance and look at them that way, we may have more leverage, right? Or get more traction as we try to move towards policies on dealing with this issue.
Well, and I think that's kind of the work our research team, right, has consistently tried to implement these kind of mixed methods approaches, but in particular thinking we use this methodology of reflexive ethnography, right? So trying to be reflective, but thinking about kind of the lived experiences from their perspectives, right? And I think that's kind of the beauty of like trying to personalize these stories. And it's a challenge. Like right now we're trying to get kind of a case study accepted into journals, right? Journals don't have that kind of history of publishing science that is focused on case studies. But you know,
They
we're
don't
trying.
now, they did before, but they don't anymore.
Yeah, before
Um,
maybe, yeah.
So, yeah, it's really trying to, I mean, we everybody knows the huge, well, I don't know if people know the extent of deportation. We really didn't talk about it. I mean, there is a huge deportation process going on in this country. And I mean, you look at people that are in federal detention centers, both in the federal prisons and in the immigration centers. I mean, it's like 80% are deportees, people that are being deported. This is a big movement going on, and I'm not sure if it's conscious or it's unconscious, but it's certainly going on, and it correlates with the large numbers of immigrants of Mexicans in the United States. And we always talk about Hispanics, right? But we usually the Latinos or Hispanics. We're really talking about Mexicans. 80%, 90% are Mexicans, and that kind of is not always clear, right, when we talk about this. But there's a huge numbers of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being deported.
But I think it's getting lost also. Well, it's getting more confounded with a lot of the Central America and South American. Like today I read the Biden administration is implementing Title 42 on Venezuelans, right? Which is preventing them from asking for asylum. So, you know, I think the UN and some other organizations are really focusing on kind of the overall health impact of these very transitory populations that are happening around the world. And so we're giving you insight into this particular population.
Yeah, that's a good point. We really try to humanize this issue. I mean, we really try to humanize. These are humans, right? And they should be given their respect. And you know, they're just not, they're criminals, right? Or they're deportees, and we don't want them here. And,
yeah, we were talking about if they were to deport every person who is of Mexican descent, who is involved in some kind of misdemeanor, you know, they would deport us all, right? So this particular population, given the context in which they have lived and grown up in the States, again, the opportunities are very limited, you know, the kind of the reduced options. And just because they don't have that documentation.
Right. But even people who have documentation, if you're a green carder and you have 2 misdemeanors, that is grounds for deportation.
Yeah, so that's happening now.
So even people who have legal status here with green cards and stuff can easily be deported. And so people have had green cards for years, for decades, right? Their parents had green cards, or they didn't make it under the 1976 immigration law that legalized a lot of the undocumented people under Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan did that. That's what we need. That's what we actually need right now, is that somebody to move towards that. But yeah, look, so even if you have a green card, you can imagine two misdemeanors. And of course, it's young people that get to misdemeanors, like I mentioned earlier, who hasn't gotten a misdemeanor for some reason or other in their younger years, right? And you could be deported for that.
And we do have a subpopulation of people who got deported through raids that happened during the Trump administration. You know, they were working, they were just these mass raids so we have those as well represented.
So no legal stuff other than the illegal immigration.
Yeah.
And what about variations in enforcement? So, you know, if somebody comes from a country in Northern Europe, has a green card, has committed 2 misdemeanors, who is going to feel the brunt of that? So there's, you know,
they were talking
discrimination.
Yeah, they were talking about that this morning in the LA Times piece, because they were comparing the Venezuelan population with the amount of asylum seekers that the Biden administration has allowed for Ukrainians currently, right? So they were doing the comparison. But also, Suzanne, you made me think of something else, and we haven't had a chance to look at this, is that the enforcement across the different states in the US. That's another issue that, you know, we have to kind of parcel out, because we do have people who are deported from across the country. So we would hypothesize, right, that these blue states who are sanctuary cities as well, we wouldn't see as many deportees, or the experiences would be different, but you'd be surprised. We have a handful of people from from LA and from Orange County who have been deported, you
And
know.
then there's our home state of Texas.
Now in Texas, don't forget it. There's so many people from Dallas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this project has really opened my eyes for the dispersion of Mexican immigrants. I mean, honestly, I've been doing work in immigration for a long time, but I never really grasped the populations, how they fit. They're all over the United States now. It's amazing, and they're being deported. We got people at our study that were deported from the Northeast, upper to the Midwest, you know, the Deep South, so it's really widespread.
And the services, like going back to, you know, kind of the importance of social work for this population. I think the services, both in Mexico and in the States, because we haven't even talked about the population that NAF has been recruiting here in LA, which is, again, you know, it's kind of the first phase of immigration. It's like the experiences that this population may have had when they first came, right? But these are adults, and just kind of the disparities and the risks that the population, the immigrants here in LA are facing as well.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. This was.
No, yeah, I think we're over
Thank you.
time.
Applause.
Right on time. Right.
And I'm sure if anyone online has, or anyone has additional questions,
Yeah,
Dr.
we'll take them.
Cepeda and Valdez will be happy to answer them offline.
Yeah, of
Hey,
course.
thanks for coming, guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, she's doing
Thank
amazing.
you.
She's doing amazing work. This young
The
lady.
things I've learned with treatment teas and